experiences in Iraq and Africa. And she was a flight nurse as well as a crew director, correct? So, you're on.
Hello. I want to welcome everyone here and thank you very much for coming. Hey, Everett. And Tammy. It's good to see everyone. How many people here are veterans? Sir? Okay. All right, good. As we go along with the program, I'm going to give you a little bit of history. I'm going to talk about the time when I served, which was from '88 through 2000, the beginning of 2012. And that was a very pivotal period for women as far as I am concerned, and I saw some dramatic changes, especially between Desert Storm and Iraqi freedom. What I want to emphasize here is that women are soldiers. We're soldiers first, women and veterans. A lot of people do forget that women are veterans. I can't tell you how many times I have gone places with my ID card for various things, to include military bases, and I keep getting asked, well, where's your husband? What's his social security number? Who's the member? Who's the spouse? Hello, it's me. And I have a hard time convincing people, and I know of other women who have gone through similar things. Hopefully that will change as women's roles have changed, and dramatically in 2016. People join the military. What I would like to bring home to civilians in particular is that the reason we are there is to defend the Constitution of the United States and to serve and obey the orders of the President of the United States. We are not necessarily there for any particular cause. If you are, that would be a secondary thing. These are the primary reasons you are in the military. People sometimes see us as political. We are anything but. When I am in uniform and when I was serving, I lost some of my First Amendment rights. I could not talk about politics. I could not talk about who I supported, who I didn't support. That I had to keep to myself. I was there to serve the President of the United States, whoever that was, whether I believed in that person or didn't. That was my job. So as far as serving for causes, another thing that can happen is you can join the military saying, I want to fight terrorists in Iraq, I want to do this, I want to do whatever. A lot of times you're going to find yourself not necessarily doing what you may have signed up for. I have a good friend of mine during the Vietnam War. He was not drafted, but he wanted to join and serve with his friends. And he wanted to join the Navy. He did. He spent 2 years in Bermuda. And there's no shame in that. That's fine. But he didn't get to do what he wanted to do. When you're in the military, you're going to go where they tell you to go and where they feel you're the best fit. So you need to keep that in mind. Myths about women who served in the military. I served in Iraq and Africa in 2004, 2005. These statements were made on a radio show out of Albany in 2008 by someone who was very well known within the community. It was a panel show. And his comments were, reservists and National Guard are only used as backfill in the United States. I know that was true in the Navy at one point, that what would happen is the positions in the States would be backfilled and the people on active duty would be sent forward. That is not the case in the Army, it is not the case in the Air Force. A lot of times, Guard and Reserve. When I was over in Iraq in 2004, the war started in 2003, out of a crews of about 50 people, I think we had 2 or 3 active duty people, the rest were all Reserve and Guard. Part of the reason for that within the medical community was when you downsize in the military, the doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists and so forth, they certainly get the training they need. They get outstanding training. But when you're downsizing these hospitals and facilities, they basically turn into clinics. So these people did not necessarily have the experience they needed to treat people who were in suicide bombings, shot at, had their limbs removed for whatever reason. They were not used to that, whereas the people in the civilian sector who came from medical centers who were reservists and Guard, and myself, I flew on a helicopter, I was in flight team, I was used to seeing people severely burned, having their limbs blown off, and those types of things. Not that I like that, but this was something I had a lot of experience with, as did other reservists and Guard. So we were pretty much in the forefront of all of this. So as far as backfill, no. Women are never sent to dangerous places. Yeah, okay, well, Iraq and Africa tend to be a little dangerous, and as we go on, you'll see more about that. Nurses don't carry weapons. I know for a long time they didn't. In Desert Storm, I had a friend who flew on a cruise. She later worked at the Pentagon. She was a commander of mine at one point as well. When she was in Desert Storm, she said there was one weapon for a 5-person flight crew, and it always went to the male. I have no idea why. When I went over in 2004, we were issued weapons. We had to fly doing our missions with the clip-in, with a round loaded, and we had that weapon on us at all times. So nurses don't carry weapons is not at all true. I have been challenged about that as well. I was in Ramstein, and we had stopped over. We had brought patients into Ramstein. We were heading back into Balad in Iraq, which is a very dangerous place, or was at that time. They had a major medical center, field medical center. They were being bombed, according to intel, 9 to 13 times a day. You have no idea what it's like trying to work as a medical person with constant incoming wounded, and sirens are constantly going off. They gave up diving for cover. That was for the other people who came there to visit as we dropped off patients or transited through. They just couldn't stop their work. They had to continue where nothing would ever get done. And they were among some of the bravest men and women I have ever seen. I don't know how they lived the way they did. All nurses are covered as non-combatants under the Geneva Convention. Oh, I started telling the story about Ramstein. We'll get to that later. That is not true either in many cases, because we do carry weapons. We no longer have the Nightingale aircraft, which was designed specifically and solely for medical missions. That went away a while ago, actually pretty much after the USS Cole got attacked, because they tried to use that plane to go and evacuate the wounded, and they wound up with quite a few logistical problems. So what happens is that the reason we are not combatants under the Geneva Convention is we're carrying weapons. We're now on cargo planes, refueler planes, so we have a mixed mission. We're moving troops, we're moving all kinds of other things, not necessarily weapons, but we're moving all kinds of things. So they're considered a combined mission. It's not strictly medical, so it is not covered under the Geneva Convention. So that is a myth. And I think a lot of people throughout the years, including the military, saw nurses, especially female nurses, as being in a protected bubble. And this was part of it. But they ran into problems with that. A little bit of history, and I don't think I have to tell too many people here because it's the Historical Society, and I'm sure you're all familiar with a lot of this. During the Revolutionary War, women served alongside of their husbands in support roles. And as their husbands fell, they picked up weapons and they would continue the fighting. This carried on throughout wars, but for different reasons. When we got to the Civil War, there were an estimated 400 women combined from both sides who dressed up as men and fought as soldiers because they could not fight as women. And if they got injured or wounded, they tended to deny medical care because they didn't want it to be found out that they were women and they would be taken out of combat. Another thing that was very beneficial that also started, I'm not sure about the Revolutionary War, but I know during the Civil War, women were used as spies. And why was that? That was because men underestimated them. They're not a threat, they're not a problem. So, put in a woman. And if anybody has any questions as we go along, please feel free to
What is
ask.
a Nightingale?
Nightingale is the medically configured aircraft. It's the C-9 aircraft. That was
Is it
the
a
Cadillac.
Or fixed wing?
It's a fixed wing. Who always asks questions? In World War II, over 25,000 women served, mostly nurses. In World War II, 140,000 served, and 60,000 were nurses who served around the world. So nurses were pretty much leading the charge as far as women being put into some interesting situations and places, and that progressed as time went on. I love this slide. This woman's face, this nurse, it pretty much describes so much. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and this one truly is. You can see the emotion, the sadness, the frustration, everything. This is from Vietnam. During the Korean War, Army nurses were the only military women in the combat theater. And there was an involuntary call of reserve nurses. It was a very large number, actually. In Vietnam, 11,000 women served, 90% as nurses. Other roles included, but not limited to, physicians, air traffic controllers, intel officers. 8 women died. Now, this is significant. As time went on, earlier on, they would list in certain articles and journals about how many women died versus how many men. So you would know that women were involved in this. At the time, I think women were seen as a minority within the military. And as time went on and things progressed, we didn't want to be seen as a minority anymore. We wanted to be seen as equal. And that's what we strived for, and I think that's where we have come now. But as time has gone on, you will see X amount. You have to come in with a minimum of a BSN. Not true in civilian life. There were diploma programs back in the day. I don't know if they still exist. And that was where you worked in the hospital, trained in the hospital. There was no college involved. In the civilian sector, you can be either a diploma nurse or you can come in with an associate's degree, which is what I did. 65% have a BSN only in the military, 25% have master's degree, and 10% have PhDs. I decided at that point that when anything he did from then on, he was going to have his women prepared, his women soldiers. I ran a weapons range. I was taught how to drive and maintain a 5-ton truck. All kinds of crazy stuff. They put me in as company commander for 6 months. These were things nurses would normally not do, but this is what he wanted for the people in his unit, especially the women. And I carried that on a bit because we did some training. We were in support of West Point, and we worked at Keller Hospital, and I thought there was no value in that because these were field nurses. You could take a blood pressure, you can do all those things, but you need to learn how to do that under very austere conditions and dangerous conditions. So I tore up the contract, had a bit of an argument with someone, and took all of my staff out of there. And I sent some of them off with a local group of Green Berets. And they took them for the day, and they taught them how to rappel, and how to do Australian rappel, which is face down. And he taught the women how to do this as well. Not that they would ever have to do this in any situation, but boy, it gave them confidence. And it was far better, I thought, value than having them work in a hospital. They could get those skills out in the field because every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, that's where we were, out in the woods. Okay, so those uniforms quickly changed into this. And this is the Vietnam equivalent of what I worked in an evacuation hospital. This was far more practical. Okay, talk a little bit about uniforms. Does anybody recognize this young woman? Jessica Lynch, have you heard of her, remember her from the Iraqi War? Okay. A lot of controversy about her. She was there in 2003, I was in 2004, and there was this whole big dust-up. One day she was a hero, the next day she was this horrible traitor. And I never went back to the story until I started doing this presentation, and I researched her, and there was so much information that was contradictory. So I found out that she had written a book, she had written a biography, so I read that. She had also testified at a congressional hearing, I think, in 2012, and she had appeared on television shows. But with that passing of time, we got the real story once the investigation is done. But right now I'm just going to talk about her in uniform. She's 5'3", she's about 100 pounds soaking wet. In this photo she's 18 years old. Now I want you to notice the hat, especially the men who've served. It's a little kind of long down over her ears. If you look at the shoulders, and you may not be able to see it on the screen, the shoulders come here. The t-shirt, I can guarantee you, comes down to her mid-thighs. All they had were men's uniforms, and that's what you had to wear. And when you're 5'4", 5'3", that can be a challenge. And you look like you've dressed in your father's old uniforms that you found in the closet. But people don't necessarily take you seriously. And she wrote in her book something that validated something I had been feeling a long time, and I've read it in other books as well. men tend to challenge you, especially drill instructors and some other people in authority. They love to challenge little petite women in uniform. They think they're going to make them cry or do whatever. It doesn't work. She talked about that in her book. I have had a few episodes like that. And I don't see a whole lot of people here from the last presentation, so we'll talk about that. I was stationed at Fort Benning, and at that time there are no women in Fort Benning. Well, there I was. So there was a day at the jump school, because they did airborne training there, and anyone could come over. And I went over in my uniform, and I did the jump off the tower and spun around and made sure I didn't slam into the other end. I did what they told me to do. Didn't like it, did it again, still didn't like it. So as I was leaving, the head drill instructor was there, and I overheard him say to the other drill instructors, "Watch this." And I'm like, oh, here we go. So he comes up to me and he gets in my face, and he said, "If you were a student in my school, I'd have you run in and blah, 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 blah." So I let him carry on, and I didn't really want to embarrass him in front of his friends, but I got close to him, stepped into him, and I said, "Let me explain something to you. I am not a student in your school. I am a second lieutenant in the United States Army. You are enlisted in the United States Army. I outrank you. Do not try this again." And I said, "This is the way this will work." And I'm smiling. I said, "Smile." I said, "You're going to take one step back. You're going to render me the appropriate salute. And then you're going to do an about face and you're going to leave." He did. Now that was not the end of that. I ran into him about a week or so later. We had bus stops. We had to take buses all over base. And he said, "Lieutenant, I wanted to talk to you." He said, "I want to get you an application for airborne school." And I said, "Why? You would be the first one throwing me out of the plane without a parachute, I have no doubt." I said no. But it was fine after that. But there have been many instances where you will find these people will do things. I had another episode at Fort Benning where I was going by a group of ranger candidates in uniform, but this time it was a captain who outranked me. And he said, "Lieutenant, come over here." And he said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "See this group?" He said, "This platoon." He said, "Put them in order and inspect them and get them ready for inspection." I'm like, okay. And he didn't think I could, because I'm a nurse woman. So I went over, put them in formation, did the appropriate orders, or commands, I should say, and that was fine. And he just looked at me and laughed and said, "Very good, thank you," and I just walked away. But people were constantly challenging you. But you just deal with it. Dress and appearance for women in the military. This gets a little crazy. There are lots of, as you know, the services have very different uniforms. They try and make them as practical as possible. They change frequently. When you go downrange or into a conflict area, when we first went, when it was September 2004, the reservists did not get issued what they call PT gear. It's what you would wear on your day off. It was shorts or pants, and it was what you would do your physical exercise in. We didn't have that, so it was 130 degrees. So we needed to wear shorts when we weren't wearing our flight suits or our BDUs. But there was this ridiculous thing. The only thing that was available on these bases were men's clothing. Yes, ma'am?
What's a BDU?
Oh, battle dress uniform. You know the camouflage? The camouflage uniforms you see, that's what it is. It's a field uniform or a battle dress uniform. So we were, there was this shorts thing, and I was an LUD'd, and I had to wear shorts with no pockets. Then I got sent to Africa where I was with the Marines, and I had to wear shorts with pockets. I have no idea why. And people would come and try and correct you about the way you looked, and it's like, I'm in an area of conflict, in a war zone. Do I really care about the shorts and the pockets? Seriously? Because as you go further into conflict, you get less and less concerned about your appearance. You really do. You want to be within regulations, but sometimes it gets ridiculous. If you've been out in the system for 36, 48 hours, as we were, when you came back, you were exhausted and you were dealing with a lot of trauma and a lot of frightening experiences, and you didn't always look your best when you came back. So, and someone would try and comment about, where's your hat? Oh, in the Air Force you couldn't wear bobby pins, but you had to wear your hair up. So I wore a ponytail, which I wasn't supposed to, and I really didn't care. But as you get further back in things, when you go to places like Ramstein, they're very particular, and Fort Benning is very particular, and where we ran into a problem was we had desert-colored uniforms, both flight suits and the battle dress uniform, and it would be 130 degrees. Now you're flying into Germany, and it's maybe 30 degrees or 40 degrees, so you needed a coat. Well, the Air Force at that time did not have the appropriate coats, so we would wear whatever we could wear over it just to stay warm. Oh, we got written up for that. That was terrible. So I contacted the Navy and used my own money, and I ordered the appropriate coats from the Navy for my people so they wouldn't get in trouble when they were in Ramstein. Hair changes, and that varies from service to service. Nails, lipstick, tattoos, I understand, are now something more acceptable. Facial tattoos, I have heard the Air Force is now allowing. Undergarments, we decide when you can wear, they decide when you can wear stockings, when you can wear socks. It gets kind of much. Yeah. Okay. We had a few things going on here. Flight suits, while we're talking about uniforms. As you can see, these are clearly designed for men. The chest is very different, and you've got these pockets, which for women are totally useless. I mean, you could put stuff in them, but it's, no. They just were never designed for women. And there have been women pilots for quite some time. A lot. But never was this a consideration. When I was in from 95 to 2012, 3 different designs, not one was ever designed for a woman. None of them. And I never understood why that was. The other thing I want to talk about is, I was the medical crew director. The person behind me, the female back there, was part of my crew. Let me introduce you to my 3 gentlemen. This was a concept that came up just before Iraqi freedom. We were flying without doctors, and we needed critical care people. I had critical care training, but I was just general flight crew and medical crew director. So what they did was they went into hospitals and they picked out the gentleman there to my right, to the left of the screen here. He is a critical care physician. The gentleman with the mustache is a critical care respiratory therapist. And the gentleman with the glasses is a critical care nurse. So when they fly on the plane, they didn't have time to really give them all the training they needed. So they didn't go to physiology training, they didn't go to the School of Aerospace Medicine. So I oversaw what they did. They could take up to 3 patients, usually on ventilators and all kinds of drips and so forth. They technically were not responsible for anyone else on the plane, any of the other patients. So that got a little bit strange, but we all worked together and we did what we have to do. And we also had medical control that was readily available on the radio, and they were amazing. But this was, the critical care teams were placed, I believe, one at certain bases, but they kept getting sent out in the system and all around, and they really had a very difficult time of it. They were originally, this team started out at my location. And I remember the very first intel briefing they got. These people are seasoned active duty military. They came out, they were like zombies. They were so terrified and shocked at the mission that was explained to them that they were about to go into. And all of the missions were pretty much that way. A flight nurse medical crew director. As I said, we generally do not fly with physicians. There is a position called a flight surgeon, but they have a whole different area of responsibility. They're basically there for physicals at bases for air crew. They fly, but they don't fly. I've never seen one on a live mission ever, and that is a problem as far as I am concerned, but nobody wanted to listen to me, and God knows I screamed about it enough. But anyway. So as a flight nurse, you go to the School of Aerospace Medicine, and I happen to think that somebody had the Space Force in mind early on to do this. What happened in flight physiology in particular is they will put you in a chamber, a pressurized chamber, and for the initial ride you go up to 42,000 feet unpressurized. You have 100% oxygen mask on, and then you have to relearn how to breathe very quickly, because you cannot breathe normally at 42,000 feet. For my first class, we go through this with pilots and fighter pilots as well. The Navy pulled the fighter pilots out of this class. They felt it was too dangerous for them. In a routine, and we also did a rapid decompression. We had 2 chambers and they were able to adjust it so it was the equivalent of a rapid decompression. And yes, we do go through rapid decompressions and insidious, slower decompressions while we were over there during flight. We had people come back with nurses, and the nurses come back with blood coming down their ears because they had totally ruptured their eardrums during the mission because something went wrong and the pressurization did not work. So that was the altitude chamber. We do something called universal qualification. So in school they have 3 mock-up aircraft, which are very different. And you have to learn, because we are full-fledged crew members now. So what we have to do is we have to understand all the oxygen systems, all the electrical systems. We have to know everything that the other people know on the aircraft as far as flight crew. We have to know emergency, what to do during a ditching, what to do during a crash, what to do if the aircraft catches on fire. We all have crew responsibilities. And then on top of that, we have to know how to deal with our patients in those scenarios. And the multiple airframes is, the idea is if you get 3 general aircraft that are very different, if something comes up and you have to do an opportune mission, and I had to do this on a plane I had never seen before, with a critical patient with no doctor, here you go. But I did have the training for it, and it was good. It worked. We go through as nurses and medical technicians who are national registered EMTs in the Air Force, multi-day annual check rides, just like a pilot, a co-pilot, a loadmaster, a navigator, an engineer. Multiple days where you have an examiner with you who's constantly throwing questions at you and putting you, there's an aircraft emergency, aircraft's on fire, oh, your patient just went into cardiac arrest, what are you going to do, how are you going to handle this? And you would go through that for several hours, a few days in a row, and that was exhausting. And we did that every 12 to 17 months you were in phase. There was also written testing you had to do, and it just on and on and on. We also had to go to survival school, both water and land, and then they added, after the Jessica Lynch, when she was, after her mission where she was injured and taken as prisoner of war, and this was a surprise, this had not happened since since World War II, this was now 2003. She was taken as a POW along with 2 other women, one of whom died shortly after. They decided it might not be a bad idea to put us through prisoner of war school. I can't talk about that. Nobody's allowed to come out and tell their stories. I've seen people come out with broken bones and lacerations. It's pretty realistic. Women were going through this course as pilots and engineers and so on and so forth, but none of the nurses, because again, we were in this little bubble and they thought we were somehow special and protected. That's my version. So let's see. Oh, and we also yearly, this was always nerve-wracking, you had to pass a Class 2 physical. The only one who does a Class 1 physical is a fighter pilot. All the other pilots and all the rest of us have to go through this physical, and you have to have perfect eyesight, perfect hearing, you've got to be the perfect weight, you've got to on and on and on and on. So everybody's stressed out before these physicals because if you didn't meet these requirements, then you were no longer on flying status. If you had a cavity, you were taken off flying status. And they allowed you to go to your own dentist and bring in a report, and then they would do these sudden inspections and bring in a dentist and line everybody up and check just to verify that what your dentist said was true. Physical training test, that went up to twice a year. That's the PT test. It is basically running push-ups and sit-ups. The Air Force always tries to get creative, and they'll add swimming, or they'll put in a bicycle because they want to be different. But that's basically what it is, and you need to pass that twice a year. You must qualify at the weapons range. When I went in originally into the Air Force, it was computer fire. It was like a computer game, and they said, no, this is not working. And then again, because we're nurses, we're women for the most part, you don't need to go to the range. You're fine. Really? I'm in the same place you are, doing the same thing you are, exposed to the same things you are. So they quickly found out that yes, nurses needed to go to the range as much as everybody else. So, military nurses serve around the world in times of conflict as well as times of peace. were on ships, helicopters, cargo and refueler aircraft, and in tents and in several other places. You're not going to find too many military nurses these days, or at least when I was in at the bedside. There weren't a whole lot of them. They used a lot of contract nurses in places like Walter Reed, Bethesda. They deployed their people out. There were some left behind, and some of the junior people were behind. Let's see. And these are some of the other things that nurses do. They were very, the medical teams in general were very helpful during COVID in New York City. They brought down the USNS Comfort, and they did all the right things. Flight nurses also transport POWs. I don't know if people know that. We have a special protocol and procedure for that. Also, let's see, and working dogs. And we will treat anyone that they give us and approve. It doesn't matter which side you're fighting on. You're there to treat the wounded, period, end of discussion. So do we take care of just American soldiers? No, we do not. We take care of anybody that needs it, so long as it's, you know, we have the proper security or whatever it is we need to go with that. This was all swirling around me and I didn't realize it. In 2003, reserve flight nurses were used as part of liaison teams embedded with combat troops into Iraq. This was a whole new concept. And what happened was these teams were comprised of, they were Air Force teams. They were comprised of a radio operator who could be a man or a woman, a medical service corps officer who could be a man or a woman, and a nurse who could be a man or a woman. And the object was you put these Air Force people who usually had prior service experience with other services, and you would embed them with the Army and the Navy as they, in this case, first into the country. And the idea was you could communicate, once they started getting wounded, the Air Force was responsible for moving them out, so we needed something to bridge that gap, because the patients have to be specially prepared because they're going on an aircraft. So there are a lot of special considerations, and you have to arrange to get transportation, whatever that is, in and out of that area, and that was all done by the Air Force. But the surprise came because these were men and women. Women don't go into combat, women aren't first in, well, yeah. So everybody was surprised at that one, and we were also trained in these liaison teams that if you went in, you may not go in as a group. Some people, the commander of the group you're embedded with, if they didn't want this, that, or the other thing, goodbye, I just want one of you, your equipment stays behind, I'm just taking the nurse. So we had those issues as well. So I asked my commander, because she was sending these people in the beginning of Iraq, and I said, she's a female, I said, did you take into consideration men or women with this when you place them with various groups, like infantry, whatever? And she said, no, why would I? They were all trained the same. They all know how to do their jobs. I don't care. And that was a good thing. But I think it was because she was a woman, she didn't really look at it. This is very important. A few of you have spoken before the presentation about the Arlington Cemetery and the women's memorial down there. This basically describes so much. It talks about, I will read it to you, I don't like to read slides, but in this case I want to. As of 2005, over 80% of all jobs and more than 90% of all military career fields are open to women. In the early 1990s, following Desert Storm, laws prohibiting women from serving aboard combat ships and combat aircraft were repealed. Policy, however, continues to restrict women from serving in the infantry, armor, artillery, and special forces, aboard submarines and in units whose primary mission is to engage the enemy in direct combat. Well, that turned out to be like pulling off a Band-Aid slowly, because now what happened was you exposed women, you gave them part equality, and then they wound up in a situation, or many situations, they should not have been in and weren't truly, not that they weren't trained, soldiers are soldiers and we're all trained to handle weapons and so on and so forth, but they weren't used to this. So the other half of this is on the unconventional battlefield of war on terror. Many men and women regularly are exposed to combat, taking and returning enemy fire and meeting the challenges of direct combat regardless of job or assignment. So, an example, Iraq 2004, female helicopter pilot, not an attack helicopter, no weapons on board. It was basically a surveillance helicopter. They were outside of Fallujah. She got shot down. She had someone else with her. So there's a whole protocol. You know what to do if you get shot down and you're in enemy territory. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and you know what to do and what not to do, and you know people have already been sent to rescue you, and you know where you need to be. But however, this woman, she saw, not too off in the distance, a group of soldiers with weapons. They knew the helicopter went down. The pilot and her co-pilot were away from the helicopter at this point, so all these people were surrounding the helicopter, and now they were trying to search for her and her partner. And she turns around real quickly, and there is a young boy on a bicycle, a local young man, and she's got a weapon with her to protect herself. But now she's got a young teenage boy standing in front of her with his bicycle. Her instant choices were, do I shoot him? And this innocent young boy. And, you know, then they're going to hear the gunshot, but it's going to take them a while to get to us. But it gives us time to reposition, but will we be repositioned in a place where they can find us? All of these things going through her head. And women up until this point had not been faced with these kinds of challenges. So she chose, let the boy go. And he went back and he alerted everybody. And while he was riding his bicycle back, she and her partner escaped and went to another location, and they were eventually rescued and unharmed. But these are things that women found themselves in all kinds of situations. Now I want you to look at the Band of Sisters. This is 2000, 2004, 2005, roughly when I was there. So women are not allowed in combat. Do you see the way they're dressed? Not too dissimilar from how I had to dress on the airplane when we were in enemy airspace and coming into these austere bases. Flak vest, helmet, gun. But we couldn't be in combat, we couldn't be infantry. And back in the 70s, they tried to do something, also pulling the Band-Aid off part way. They wanted equality for men and women when it came to promotion and when it came to pay. Pay, yes. Promotion kind of depends. I'll speak specifically for nurses. When you have male nurses and female nurses, if a dangerous assignment came up, they would always pick the male. So when it came time for promotion, he had extra credits, shall we say, for doing whatever it is he did. And that eventually changed too. But just look at these women and you can see. It's kind of, we're in transition at this point. Okay, in the blink of an eye, and this is the point I'm trying to get to, things change so quickly. Even going back to the coal, and this is when I had to look at pictures and names, and I was involved in this. Unfortunately, I was duty officer at Ramstein. We did not have an Africa command at that time. We got one shortly after this. But we had 37 wounded that had to be moved out of the area. I don't even know how they got to Djibouti, Africa. I was the duty officer at Ramstein for the 86th Air Evacuation Squadron, and it was their task to get these people back home. We didn't even know where they were. And I come into the office, and my boss is there, and she's a female lieutenant colonel, and she goes, "Where is Djibouti?" And I said, "I have no idea." And we found out it's in Africa. And we found out that it's bordered by Ethiopia, Somalia, and it is across from Yemen. So, not a good situation. But this was something people did not expect. They were there to refuel. They did not expect to be attacked and blown up. So again, you have women on a ship, you know, they get killed with everybody else, unfortunately. The Jessica Lynch story is the Nasiriyah, Iraq in March 23 of 2003, less than 3 days into the war. 9 people were killed, to include 1 woman, and technically 3 were taken POW and 1 died shortly thereafter. And the military was kind of caught short with this. They were a convoy going in, I don't think it was the 3rd Infantry, but they were following an infantry division. They were right behind them as they were invading Iraq. And Jessica Lynch and these 2 other women, they were supply clerks. They were supposed to be back home and working at a desk. This was never something anyone thought. They never thought they would be in this position. And it was a convoy, so okay, fine, our infantry has gone up. Now we have this whole convoy that is miles long, and it should be fine. Well, as time goes on with this convoy, trucks start to break down, things start to happen, they start to get separated. And the next thing you know, people are heading off in the wrong direction because they have gotten so separated. So these people wound up in a very bad place. And the military doesn't talk a whole lot about this particular incident. I see it, you really have to search to find it. I was in Al Udeid and my mission, we went to Mosul, Iraq a lot. It was in northern Iraq. It was an army field hospital, and all the people that worked there, all to me, seemed to be very young, very energetic, and it was an unusual place to go into because they would kind of like storm the aircraft. And the big thing is, the medical crew director, you have to control the back of the aircraft and how they bring on the wounded and when they bring on the wounded. You don't want someone sneaking in, a terrorist or someone, because there's so much commotion, you might miss something, so we tried to control it very tightly. But in Mosul, these people were very, they were just amazing people. Also, I just want to go into this a little bit. When you went to a meal over there, and I was in Al Udeid, but anywhere there or in Iraq, I was very stunned. I walked in and everything was kind of buffet style, and then you had people that were serving you food, and they were local people who wanted to work there, who were vetted. However, there was always the possibility that someone could get to their family or to them the day they came into work and say, okay, if you don't do something horrible to these people for us, we're going to destroy your family. So you never knew. So that explained why behind the people that were feeding me and everyone else, there were American soldiers with M16 trained on the people who were feeding us. That was a little disturbing. You were never comfortable eating a meal, I can tell you that. Hence, Mosul, that's what happened there. There are two different theories about this. I heard they were bombed, but the initial story I got, and I was with the crews that went out to respond to this, it was a bombing. Someone had come in with a backpack and blew up. Now, the bombing in Afghanistan was horrible. This was far worse, if you can say that. It was inside a mess tent, and there were 22 dead and 77 wounded. These were people you work with every day for perhaps a year. These were people you worked alongside of. And I don't want to get graphic, but please understand, when it's a bombing like this, you now have a pile of human beings, and you have to find out who's living and who's dead. And that's as far as I'll go with that. These things are beyond horrific. And then our teams go and respond to it. And we don't know these people as well, but these are people you see coming up to the plane over there once or twice a week. They're 18, 19 years old. It is 5 days before Christmas. Not only will they not be home for Christmas, some of them will never be home again, and the 77 that hopefully do make their way home will never be the same again, especially around Christmas. So these things happen in a second. Okay, just to give you a little context of where things are here. Nasiriyah was the place with the convoy where the 9 were killed following the infantry in. Baghdad, I'm sure you all know. When I was there, it was the biggest battle of Fallujah and Mosul up in the north. Those were the high points when I was there. Now, has anybody heard of this woman? You have, okay. Cool. When we go back to that story of Jessica Lynch, this was her best friend. She liked to be called Lori Pye, and you can read about her. She was the hero of this particular incident, and most people have never heard of her, but most people don't know who she is. She was the best friend to Jessica Lynch, who got all the attention and was made out to be this little, in her words, a little girl Rambo. The way this played out was when they rescued Jessica Lynch, she had, well, the way the battle went was people were outside of their vehicles because their vehicles had broken down in the convoy. Things were getting a little tense, and they realized they were not where they were supposed to be, and they were going to try and find a way out. Lori still had a vehicle, so she went around picking people up, to include Jessica Lynch. They wound up in the middle of this town. People were poised around them with weapons, rocket launchers, so on and so forth, and they found themselves kind of trapped. So she yelled to Jessica to get down. Jessica crunched down in this vehicle, Humvee, and then they got hit by an RPG. Now, they had a rocket-propelled grenade. They had a vehicle behind them, a vehicle in front of them. The vehicle got pushed up and slammed into the vehicle in front of them. Jessica Lynch wound up with her spine broken in 2 places. Her ankle was crushed. She had major damage to her right arm. Lori had a major head injury. They captured her, but she died shortly after. Lori is very interesting because she and Jessica were in basic together, and Lori was her best friend, and Jessica got deployed, and Lori was not going to be deployed because she was on a medical deferment because she had a shoulder injury. But she insisted on going, and they allowed her to go because she wanted to be with her best friend. And she tried to save her best friend, and she died. And between the press and the Pentagon, I don't know who, we were not looking to place blame, and neither was she, but Jessica Lynch, that's the next slide, is now, I think, 19 years old, spine broken in 2 places, all these injuries. She had been prisoner of war. She had probably been sexually assaulted before she wound up being taken to medical care. She is now hearing, and she was unconscious, but she's hearing about how she took up a weapon, she fought off the Iraqis, she was a hero, she was this, she was that, and she said, no, I wasn't. I was a victim. And this is researching this 20 years later. And she got up. This was at the time, though, when she was she was still in the hospital just for a few days, and she was reading all these stories. But she said, I was a victim, I was not a hero. She said, my friend was a hero, and you're not even talking about her. So at that point, she was labeled like a traitor, and she was ungrateful, and all this other stuff. And that was unjustified. The other woman, Specialist Shoshana Johnson, I don't know much about her. I know she was captured at the time. I do not believe she was with the other 2 women. They rescued her 22 days later. She also wrote a book, but it seems to be basically what happened after she recovered from her injuries. I don't think she went into what happened to her. I don't know. She got shot in both ankles, I know that. And that's pretty much all I know about her, because there's not much out there. And I went into a women's military site that was done by military women, and it was about the progression of women and the history of women in the military, and they talked about Vietnam, they talked about Korea, they talked about Afghanistan and Iraq. None of these women were ever mentioned, ever. Because it was a failed operation, and it went bad, and the military looked bad. The Washington Post wrote the initial story. They had to retract the entire thing because it was all fiction. But again, not blaming who said what to who. But it just wasn't right. And Jessica always said, she goes, if they just told the story the way it really happened, it would have been amazing. But they didn't. So, and this gives you a little better perspective. I was in Qatar, down here. Theoretically, that's where I was. That's where I slept occasionally, did my laundry, and that's where my paperwork was. All my missions were in Iraq and then 30 days over in Africa. This is Al Udeid, and I just want you to get a feeling for this is what it looked like on Christmas. This is what it looked like on 4th of July. It was never any different. It started out to 130 degrees, went down to 90, and at that point we were wearing sweats with hoods because we were cold. We had water outside and it would boil. So anyway, when we go into a foreign country like this, we have to negotiate what's going to happen both culturally and religiously and so on and so forth. We were not allowed to have anything religious, which meant we couldn't celebrate Christmas, we couldn't do anything. And even worse than that, they said that they would and could open our mail, and if anyone sent us anything that was thought to be contraband, it would be taken. And it was. Not often, but it was. So this was our Christmas, and we were not happy. I mean, it's just, you could do stuff in your room. Okay, and this goes back to Mosul. And this woman was the medical crew director who responded to the bombing at Mosul with people she knew. We were not allowed to have the Christmas tree. We were going through a little PTSD at this point, all of us, and we were very upset. So the next morning, after crew rest, she calls everybody outside and she goes, we're building ourselves a Christmas tree in honor of these people that died. I'm done. Okay, fine. You get a bucket, you go get all the wire hangers, you get me some duct tape, you do this. So here is our Charlie Brown Christmas tree made out of coat hangers, a mop handle, and whatever else we could find. So we couldn't do this. So somebody went to the wing commander and complained as we were doing it. The next thing you know, the military police show up, armed, and you need to take that down right now, blah, 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 blah. With that, from the back of the building come the Marines, Marine aviators, and everybody on base knew what happened, and they said, they went up to the military police as we continued to build our Christmas tree. And they said, they gotta stop that. And they said, you're not stopping them. He said, you know what these women have been, men have been through. He said, let them have their Christmas tree, please. So they did. The only thing was we couldn't have lights on it. There was nowhere to plug in lights. But that was our Christmas tree. So now at our Veterans Park in town, the big tree that we have is done in memory of people who have not been home for Christmas and who are presently not home for Christmas, who are serving somewhere else in the war or in the world. And that's why we have that tree. We look at them and we have that in memory of them. And then when I see that tree, I think of this. And I'm glad that the community is now adding to that and making that so even more special than it was. But there was no messing with us during this. Djibouti, Africa. If you look on the map, you'll see where it is, garden spot of the world, right across from Yemen, Ethiopia, Somali pirates. It's just wonderful. We were living in tents at the time, dirt roads, so if it rained, that turned into a mud bog. Most of the women there were maybe 50, 60 female Marines, and we did not want to mess with them. I saw them doing hand-to-hand combat with men in these pits, and I wouldn't mess with them. They were tough. But they were housed in a totally different place. I was in one of these tents in the back here with my crew, a man and a woman. And we were by the back. Where's Isabel? The back wall. Remember you talk about the wall and people coming in versus getting out? I always think of you because, well, it was different. We didn't want people getting in, but they would try. So one night I had to go to the bathroom, and the porta-san was way across on the other side because we're sleeping. We're in tents and we have cots. So I got to walk out of the tent, and there's an M1A1 Abrams tank coming around with these point guards with all this heavy weaponry. And I'm thinking, this is not the time to be going to the porta-san. So I turned around and I went back in. I heard them talk about that they thought intruders had come into the encampment. And I felt very comfortable because I was surrounded by the United States Marines, and there were special forces there as well. So I went back into my tent and I went right to sleep. I was not worried. And if you'll notice along the side of the tent, you'll see that there are sandbags. And that's because if there was fire, we could drop below that level and hopefully not get hurt. And also our cots were right at that level. So this was a very interesting place to be. It was basically, at the time, an anti-terrorist task force that we were supporting. And the deal was, supposedly, we would fly them out if they became sick, or if there was a mission further back in Africa and they got brought here, we would fly them out to a higher level of care. I got invited onto a flight with a female pilot, her first fueled air-to-air refueling with a C-130 from a Sea Stallion. And she was amazing. These photos came from Combat Camera. So we did the refueling, which was pretty impressive, and then the next thing I know, the back opens up and here comes the 50 cal. Directly across from me comes the 50 cal. This was after we had stopped and we left Combat Camera, and we're going on our way, and I said, why am I still on this aircraft? And they said, well, we're just going on a routine patrol mission for 4 hours. Probably, I don't even know where I was. I'm guessing from the coastline of Somalia. And I said, so why am I here? This is not part of what I'm supposed to do. And they said, well, yeah, it's a mission, it's a patrol mission, and we normally don't have medical people, and how nice is it to have a nurse, and we know that you work in helicopters back home, so this is just great. So here I was on this mission. I did have permission to be on it, but it was like, but it was uneventful and it was fine, and you wind up in all kinds of places doing that. So here's one of the aircraft. There were two, and they refueled off the C-130, and that is incredibly impressive. Yeah. As was the guy hanging out the back, and we landed a few places, did a few things, and I just kind of, I don't know, nothing to do with me. This is the inside of an Australian C-130 Stretch. Over a dozen of our planes had suddenly been taken out of service because when you do combat landings and takeoffs, you go straight up, and it puts a lot of stress on the aircraft, and they found stress cracks in the wings, 13 in a day. All of our aircraft were down, so they sent us out with the Australians. In the beginning, they told us this was never going to happen. We would never fly with the Australians. We didn't know their policies and procedures. We barely spoke the same language. We had a checklist that we followed. They followed a different one, which I had never seen. And they were known to be a little less cautious with things, or bolder with what they did, so you never knew who was going to react, how they were going to react. This is a bit of a hot mess. We have patients on board, they're in the front, they're all ambulatory, and you can see the flags that are hanging on the plane. That's quite an honor. We will all take flags, hang them, and then we can do a ceremonial thing where they're put in a case with a plaque, and we give them to people saying this flag is flown on a mission and you have all the information on it. It's very special, but we always did this during our flights. This is my crew. And you'll notice that the young woman in front of me, she's got her shoulder holster on. The rest of us have waist holsters. The woman to the right was from my squadron back home. She did 2 tours in Baghdad, and they were not good tours. And just look at the expression on her face. It's kind of blank. What happened was when you send nurses out, she was a nurse practitioner, and she was used to working in an office. I mean, she had hospital training, she was prior Army, but I don't think anybody was used to what they saw and what they were faced with, especially in Baghdad, where they had lots of explosions and so on and so forth, and all that goes with that, and I think that kind of weighed on her. So anyway, on the plane, she comes with this one right out of Baghdad, and we're with an Australian front-end crew. We're on an aircraft that's a slight bit different. We picked up our patients, we're now taking off, and we get 300 feet off the runway, up into the air, and then all of a sudden there's a loud explosion, everything lights up, the plane shakes, and then things start to go into motion, as kind of like Sully when he landed in the Hudson. It's just automatic, you practice it so much, everybody has a role, they have things to do. So they radio into this wonderful place, there are 2 of them on the planet. They're secret, they have lots of interesting people and things in them, but they have pilots, they have engineers, anyone that you would find on our aircraft you would find in this location. So the deal is when something goes wrong, we immediately go through the crew, pilot, engineer, nav, medical crew director, and you each give a report as to, what's going on. Is the aircraft functioning? Yes, it is. Engineers, there's a whole process for it. Yeah, everything's fine. Medical crew director, my patients are stable. Okay, fine. They radio into this place who then looks at everything for us. They tell us where we can land, so on and so forth. And then they actually asked, they had come to a decision as to what they were going to do, both the people on the aircraft and the people in this command center. And then they asked me, as medical crew director, how are your patients? This is where we want to bring them. Do you feel that's adequate for the care they need? And I said, absolutely, because we're bringing them back to the base I came from, and yes, they could handle what we had. But the point is, everybody is included. And it's a joint decision, and it's really great to see how well that actually does work when it has to. This is not a C-130, this is a C-17. However, when you fire chaff and flares, which is what happens when your aircraft is under attack, you do this. And what it does is it creates a smoke screen around the aircraft, so if they're trying to aim in on something or zero in on something, they really can't see it. And it's plastic and aluminum, and it's hot, it's on fire, so if they're heat-seeking missiles or they have that capability, they are thrown off track. So this automatically fires off the aircraft.
Magnesium?
There may be magnesium too.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So here we are back at the beginning, women serving in the military and in all roles doing all kinds of things, and reservists and guard are just as much. We are totally interchangeable, or at least we were when I was there. We had a 72-hour notice to go and fill in for an active duty person, and we could do it. Because we had to keep the same standard that they had. And that's part of the reason I retired early from my civilian job, was because the requirements for the military after 9/11 just got more and more and more in order to be able to maintain that standard. I couldn't do that with a full-time job, and neither could a lot of other people. So that's pretty much my presentation. Does anybody have any questions about anything?
What is a stretch aircraft?
And to tell you the truth, I don't know what makes it entirely different. I'm just assuming it's got a few more feet in it.
On the 141s, when they stretched them out, they cut the pine in half, they stuck in a whole new section in the middle, and that became a stretch 141.
Okay.
I used to give tours on them.
Oh,
A
really?
lot of
I
them.
flew on 141s too, and then they were taken out.
It was parked when I fell out.
Oh,
And I got caught at the bottom of the ladder by somebody who was waiting to come up.
oh, okay. Any other yes, sir?
I wanted to see if you clarify the statement about the Pentagon, because you said you had branch, you had general, then you got commanders. There's no commanders in the Pentagon. There may be admirals, but I will never see any, maybe a captain, or a Navy captain, but never Navy commanders.
Well, I think what I was referring to, and I may have misspoke, the person that I worked with, who was my commander, then worked
Oh,
at
so
the Pentagon.
you listed the rank general, okay. You didn't mean rank. You meant.
No.
Oh, okay.
And, you know, so I'm sorry, I do tend to sometimes not make that clear.
Thank you.
But yeah. Any other questions about anything? Clarification, yes, ma'am?
I don't have a question. I have some pictures of my mother-in-law. She was a WAC,
Mhm.
and it's very interesting. She drove the big shots in Rhode Island, Boston, that whole area. And I have some pictures here. I'll leave over there, and people are welcome to look at them. And you could see how well-dressed the women are.
Yes, it was very fashionable. At one point, it was required to have lipstick and makeup and so forth. And I have to tell you, people made fun of us because we always did that. We always did wear makeup and stuff, and they were, why would you do that? Well, it really made a difference. It made a difference to people, because men and women, patients, because they'd be in a lot of pain or they'd be traumatized from whatever, and they look up and they go, oh, you remind me of my sister. You remind me of my mother. But okay. You know, and it kind of brought them out of their trauma just for a few minutes and reminded them of home. And there were enough people that said that we were like, okay, we'll do this, you know. No, we're not trying to look gorgeous or anything like that, but it just helps people to do, it just made them more comfortable. There you go, normalizes, that's true. And then we met people, I met special ops groups, especially in Africa. And I was a little concerned, it was a very isolated place, it was very dark, and these were special forces, and they had a very bad reputation around women. However, none of that has ever been true that I have seen in the military in my 24 years. I went and with these men, it was all just, where are you from? New York City. Oh, okay. Hey, have you been to Broadway? Have you seen the thing at the Met? Have you seen, you know, what books do you read? It's just having a woman around because they haven't been around a woman in so long, and just having a conversation. And again, reminding them of being at home with their sister or whoever. And it just makes them feel a little more relaxed and seems to help.